Everything you see around you was built on stolen labor. The banks, the brands, even the borders. Not by accident, but by design. Secular Europe didn't just exploit slavery. They weaponized it, industrialized it, and globalized it. From colonial blood trade to imperial extraction, the modern world was powered by stolen lives. When the chains grew too expensive, exploitation didn't end. Instead, it evolved. From debt to wages, from forced labor to invisible contracts, the machinery of enslavement simply changed tools. Robin D.G. Kelley, in Freedom Dreams, stated that the modern world system, from its very inception, has depended on slavery, colonialism, and racial capitalism. These systems are not relics, they are constitutive. The modern world wasn't built despite slavery. It was built because of it. The question isn't if the West enslaved. The question is, has slavery ever ended? Or did the West just find a smarter, more profitable disguise? In Judaism, slavery was never a moral accident. It was encoded into halakha. The Torah allows Hebrews to enslave non-Hebrews and their descendants. You may acquire male and female slaves from the nations around you, as stated in Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 44. A Hebrew servant, by contrast, must be freed in the 7th year, as stated in Shemot, chapter 21, verse 2. This dual standard wasn't a minor detail. It created a legal caste, native sons versus perpetual outsiders. Catherine Hesser, in Jewish Slavery in Antiquity, describes slavery as not only accepted in ancient Jewish society, but regulated in rabbinic law. The legal distinction between Jewish and non-Jewish slaves reflects a hierarchical ethnocentric worldview embedded in halakhic discourse. Jewish slaveholding was real, but it never scaled. Jewish communities were minorities under larger empires: Babylonian, Persian, Roman, Christian, and Islamic. Their capacity for systemic slavery was limited by circumstance. Jonathan Schorsch, in Jews and Blacks in the Early Modern World, explained that while Jews participated in slaveholding across various societies, they did not develop or impose a unique Jewish system of slavery. Their practice reflected the legal and economic frameworks of host nations. Some Jews in Europe and the Americas owned slaves, but they did so within Christian frameworks, not from Torah-driven expansion. The rabbinic tradition softened the harshness, adding protections, regulating cruelty, encouraging manumission. But it never abolished the institution. In the end, Jewish slavery was circumstantial, not civilizational. It existed, but it never expanded. Hinduism didn't need plantations. It had caste. The Manusmriti chapter 8 verse 413 declares, "A Shudra, whether bought or unbought, may be forced to serve a Brahmin, for he was created to be their slave." The Oxford Handbook of Caste stated that the caste system, especially the treatment of Dalit, has deep theological roots in Hinduism. The Manusmriti, which codifies much of the caste system, reflects a worldview in which servitude and exploitation of lower castes are justified as part of divine order. For Hindus, slavery wasn't a transaction. It was a theological birthmark. Entire castes of Dalits and Shudras were sentenced to servitude by divine design. But unlike chattel slavery, caste slavery was internal. It didn't cross oceans because it didn't need to. The violence was local, generational, and system-wide. From temple duties to sewage cleaning, Dalits were bound to service by scripture. Indrani Chatterjee, in Slavery and South Asian History, explained that caste-based forms of subjugation in India operated as a system of social slavery that functioned alongside, but independent of, plantation slavery, and was perpetuated through religious and social doctrine. Hinduism didn't industrialize slavery, but it fossilized it. Even today, bonded labor in India reflects this ancient caste architecture. The slavery persists, not in plantations, but in brick kilns, salt pans, and textile sweatshops. And like Judaism, Hinduism preserved its slave logic through spiritual sanction, not abolition. The caste logic remains embedded in the bones of the faith. Christianity is a much different case. It didn't stumble into slavery, but sanctified it. The papal bull Dum Diversas in 1452 gave Portugal divine authority to enslave non-Christians. But that was only the rubber stamp. From Constantine's empire to Charlemagne's forced conversions, the cross had long been weaponized. From conquest by faith to enslavement by creed. David Bryan Davis, in Inhuman Bondage, exposed Christianity as not merely compatible with slavery, it had come to sanctify it. For centuries, the Church provided the moral framework that allowed Christians to see slavery not as an evil, but as part of God's natural order. By the time of the transatlantic slave trade, Christian theology had long since absorbed slavery into its worldview. The transatlantic slave trade wasn't just blessed, it was engineered by Christian empires. Over 12 million Africans were trafficked across oceans, with crosses on the sails and scripture on the lips. Popes issued decrees. Priests baptized the ships. Bishops became plantation owners. Even missionaries trafficked humans under the pretense of saving their souls. Katie Geneva Cannon, in Christian Imperialism and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, stated that the transatlantic trade in Africans was founded on Christianity. Religion was key in motivating Prince Henry of Portugal, later called Henry the Navigator, to seek out new lands and peoples to convert and exploit. The curse of Ham was racialized into theology. Paul's command for slaves to obey their masters became church policy. Augustine called slavery a consequence of sin. Aquinas called it part of natural order. This wasn't a deviation from Christian ethics. It was the Christian ethics itself. The Church didn't debate whether slavery was moral. It debated who could be enslaved and how. Daina Ramey Berry, in The Price for Their Pound of Flesh, explained how pro-slavery theologians twisted the biblical story of the curse of Ham. They used it to construct racial hierarchies, positioning black people as inherently destined for servitude and reinforcing the justification for their enslavement. This wasn't limited to Africans. Slavs, Jews, and heretical Christians were also fair game. Church councils codified the slavery of infidels. The Inquisition punished runaway slaves. Theology became a caste system, baptized Europeans on top, while the rest are in chains. The Anglican Church, the Catholic Church, the Moravians, and the Methodists were all implicated. The Jesuits ran plantations in the Americas. The Anglican Church held stock in slave companies. Christianity offered spiritual equality while institutionalizing earthly bondage. And when abolition came, the Church resisted. Bishops lobbied to preserve slavery. Christian planters cited scripture to defend ownership. Abolitionists were often branded heretics, radicals, or traitors. Not heroes. Catherine Gerbner, in Christian Slavery, described that Christianity's relationship with slavery has been marked by profound contradictions. While the faith espoused spiritual equality, it often coexisted with, and at times endorsed, systems of human bondage. By the time Brazil, the last Christian colony, abolished slavery in 1888, Christianity had already built global wealth on human cargo. And as the industrial age began, the faith that once justified chattel slavery quietly passed the baton to capitalism. The empire of faith became the empire of cash. Christianity didn't merely permit slavery. It turned slavery into a theology of empire. And when history turned against it, it passed the whip to capitalism and washed its hands with scripture. Islam was born into a world where slavery was the norm. But unlike others, it began unwriting the rules. The Quran didn't invent slavery, but it redefined the terms. Freeing a slave appears repeatedly as expiation, such as Surah Al-Balad, verse 13. Freeing slaves is not just permitted, it's praised. If anyone kills a believer by mistake, let him free a believing slave, commands Surah An-Nisa, verse 92. Jonathan A.C. Brown, in Slavery and Islam, concluded that Islamic law did not introduce slavery, but profoundly transformed it, placing tight restrictions on its practice, prohibiting the enslavement of free persons, and integrating manumission into acts of piety and legal atonement. No slavery by birth, no family separation, no race-based bondage. Islamic law forbids enslaving free individuals. Manumission is encouraged in worship, marriage, and atonement. The Prophet Muhammad freed slaves throughout his life and instructed others to do the same. Where the Christian world expanded slavery into an industry, the Islamic world shrank it into extinction. By the time Christian empires were globalizing the trade, Muslim scholars like Al-Kharafi, Ibn Hazm, and Al-Mawadi were restricting its scope, imposing strict regulations, and limiting its social and economic impact. Bernard Freamon, in Possessed by the Right Hand, summarized that while slavery remained legally permissible in Islamic jurisprudence, the ethos of the Quran and Sunnah consistently encouraged emancipation. Unlike in Christendom, The Islamic world never developed slavery into a race-based system or a plantation economy. One of Islam's most radical legal tools was mukataba, a contract through which a slave could purchase their freedom in installments, often supported by public charity. This wasn't a loophole. It was canonized in Surah An-Nur verse 33. And those of your slaves who seek a writing of emancipation, give it to them if you know goodness in them. No equivalent existed in any other sacred law or imperial code. Islam made manumission a process, not a miracle. Bernard Freamon, in Possessed by the Right Hand, described the Quranic articulation of the mukataba contract as a profound shift, giving slaves a pathway to liberation that was not reliant on the slave owner's generosity, but instead grounded in a legally enforceable contract supported by the broader Islamic ethos of manumission. Islamic law didn't just regulate slavery, it dismantled the foundation. The result? Slavery in Muslim lands diminished centuries before abolition in the Christian West. And it never became the economic backbone of the empire. Slavery no longer flies a flag or wears a cross. Today, it wears a logo. The plantations became factories. The whips became debt. The masters became multinationals. This is no accident. It's the final form of a centuries-old theology, now dressed in liberal rhetoric and marketed as freedom. Robin D.G. Kelley, in Freedom Dreams, exposed that slavery never ended. It simply evolved into systems of racial capitalism, wage labor, and mass incarceration. The plantation became the corporation. Christianity baptized the empire, but secularism industrialized it. The Enlightenment didn't end slavery, but rebranded it. Voltaire mocked the church, but bought into the sugar trade. Adam Smith wrote about liberty, while the ports around him trafficked slaves. Abolition was never a rupture. It was a rebrand, a public virtue masking private profiteering. The Western world didn't abolish slavery. Instead, they make it more efficient. Modern slavery doesn't rely on chains. It uses contracts, wages, and debts to keep millions in perpetual servitude. International Labour Organization concluded that an estimated 50 million people were living in situations of modern slavery on any given day in 2021, according to the latest global estimates of modern slavery. Judaism never scaled into empire. Hinduism's caste chains remain internal. But the Christian West turned human bondage into a global supply chain. Today, millions of people live under modern slavery, many for the benefit of the same Western powers that once baptized the chains. And the system doesn't apologize. It adapts. Modern slavery is legal, digital, and invisible. Slavery is not just history, it's infrastructure. The Christian world used theology to justify it. The secular world used economics to preserve it. But Islam stands apart, not just in doctrine, but in direction. Yaqeen Institute, in Slavery and Emancipation in the Sharia, stated that the most distinct feature of how the Quran and the Sunnah treat slavery is the obsession with emancipating slaves. Indeed, no scripture is more emphatic on this topic. No other global tradition encoded manumission as virtue. No other system turned worship into liberation. Islam's rejection of racial and perpetual servitude was woven into the very fabric of the faith, ensuring that no system could ever use slavery as a cornerstone of power. The chains were never allowed to spread. In a world that still polishes shackles under the guise of modernity and progress, Islam becomes the lighthouse for those who seek guidance and liberation. It breaks their chains and frees their souls, leading them to true freedom. It is the antidote to the venom of the secular West.